So Jacob, thanks for coming to Head-Fi HQ. I think one of the biggest benefits of having Head Acoustics U.S. headquarters so nearby, 30 minutes away, is that we get to visit your labs regularly and that you guys visit us regularly. So thanks for coming out.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to talk about multidimensional audio quality score, or MDAQS.
Yep.
It's something that we are going to use. We've been using, but we haven't really been posting results from yet that much. But we will be increasingly so, especially in 2024. We had a conversation with Dr. Gierlich, now retired.
Yep.
And that was probably more technical than a first discussion about MDAQS should be maybe for some people. So let's talk about what MDAQS is for people who may not have a technical understanding of headphone measurements or acoustics or a technical understanding of human perception. Because there's one thing I think most humans, hopefully watching this, will understand is humanity.
Mm-hmm.
What humans like, what they don't. So what's MDAQS?
It's a good question. In its simplest form, MDAQS is an algorithm rooted in human perception that tells us what the perceived audio quality is going to be for a example audio playback device. And for this discussion, let's keep that to headphones only.
Sure.
And because it is rooted in human perception, it's more than just one single number that indicates the overall quality score. It also includes 3 dimensions that are used to help form that impression. Again, this is based on research into human preferences. Those 3 dimensions are timbre, distortion, and immersiveness. So it's an algorithm that gives us the 3 subdimensions and an overall quality score for a pair of headphones.
So to use MDAQS, well, okay, let's go back a step. You mentioned that it takes into account human perception.
Yep.
There is research very, very popular in our community specific to headphones and preferences. It's a study in which, or a series of studies in which, and I think it's the best publicly available research of its type, where they determined what people like in terms of sound by letting them kind of control certain things until they could determine what they liked in terms of the sound, and then memorializing that as 2 frequency response targets, one for in-ears, one for over-ears. There's a certain amount of, I think it's if you match the target, you would, there's like a 64% of people or something thereabouts would like the sound of that device. Now let's talk about that with respect to MDAQS. What's the difference?
Yeah, the difference is really that while this other study is rooted in some human perception, MDAQS is as well, and it involves these multiple dimensions because human perception is formed by more than just a single dimension. And I would equate frequency response as just looking at the audio quality in terms of a single dimension to human perception. And it's a little bit akin to judging the experience of driving a car solely by how fast it accelerates from 0 to 60 in some sense. So just like you can judge how fast the car accelerates by that time, 0 to 60, we can judge something about a headphone performance by looking at a frequency response. But it far from tells us everything we need to know about how that headphone sounds and likewise how that car drives. There's much more to the experience than just how fast you accelerate. There's the braking element of driving a car, there's steering, there's feel, there's handling, there's top speed, there's vibration as well when you're driving the car. Similarly, I would argue that for headphones, it's much more than just frequency response. And our data, this is years worth of research, 6 years worth of research, where we have also done countless studies and interviews and jury studies to find that there's much more to the human experience than just a single dimension, than more than just frequency response. So MDAQS includes many more elements of human perception to form the overall quality perception for a pair of headphones.
Now, earlier I was mentioning, and I touched on another body of research where we could say with some confidence that around 64% of people would like my product if it met the frequency response targets in question. Is it reasonable to say that with MDAQS, say it's a score 1 through 5, 5 being the best, If I evaluated a headphone with MDAQS, we'll get into how that's done shortly, and it scores a 5, which is the best, would you say that I could have a higher degree of confidence that people would like that the average consumer would like that, versus the other target that I talked about at, say, 64%?
I would. I would argue that yes, you would, simply because our data showed a much higher correlation than 64%. We were north of 90%
Okay.
in our data. And I think part of the reason for that is because the MDAX algorithm includes many more elements to human perception than just the spectral balance, which is essentially what frequency response is.
So let's talk about which dimensions it includes. What are the 3 dimensions? There's
The 3 dimensions that we found to be significantly relevant to the overall quality perception are timbre, distortion, and immersiveness. So timbre involves frequency response to a very large extent. The spectral balance of the headphone is very important, but it's more than that. Timbre, as you might know from music, there's also an element of the temporal. The time domain is also important, and the harmonic content is also important in how we perceive timbre. For distortion, maybe it's a little self-explanatory, but it's basically all the unwanted junk that shows up in the reproduction. So anything the headphone's playing out that really shouldn't be there, that is going to be picked up as under the distortion dimension. And then lastly, immersiveness, that has to do with the source width and position and how it's reproduced sort of in space when you're listening to it.
Okay. Now, what I'm about to say is more of a statement, just to explain to everybody that the output for MDAQS, that is what you finally see. And it's so important, I think, to talk more about this, because it just numbers like that will look reductive. So you have essentially 4 numbers. Again, scores 1 through 5. A number for a mean opinion score of 1 through 5 for timbre and immersiveness, distortion. Then there's a 4th number, which is the overall score. And to be clear, of course, it's informed by its performance in these other dimensions, in the 3 separate dimensions, but it is not just a simple average of the 3 scores from those 3 dimensions.
That is correct. Very early on, and you might be able to locate these research papers online that we have published, we did actually use a linear regression model to calculate the overall quality score, but very quickly we found that there are corner cases, many of them actually not in the corner, so just a lot of cases where the linear regression model does not work. So it's not just a simple average or a simple weighting to get from the 3 dimensions to the overall quality. And what we end up using, sort of the nom du jour, is going to be machine learning or AI, but we're using essentially a bunch of regression models where we can take the 3 dimensions and end up with the overall quality score. So it's sort of its own separate recalculation based on those 3 dimensions.
Can we talk now briefly, and let's try to keep it as simple as we can, about each of the 3 dimensions, maybe just a little more detail. So let's talk about timbre.
Yep.
Actually, you know what? Before we get there, I want to talk about procedure, because I think before we get to these other dimensions, let's talk about what it looks like to do an MDAQS evaluation. If you watched a video of me with no sound doing a headphone measurement using a standard audio analyzer, which I still think is important to do, you'd see me putting the headphone on an ear simulator, a mannequin, that has ear simulators that simulate the load, a human load. Man, I want to try to keep this as simple as possible. Anyways, you'd see me putting it on a mannequin and then hitting some buttons on the keyboard. It's going to send a signal to the headphone. The analyzer is going to get that back from the headphone and the simulator, and then spit out, you'd typically run a sweep, whoop, right? And then it'll spit out the frequency response and other measurements that you can glean from that sweep.
Yeah.
All right. If you watched me doing an MDAQS measurement, procedurally, it's not going to look that different. Again, if there was no sound or anything like that, right? If you couldn't hear the stimuli in question, right, that you're playing into the headphone, again, it's going to look the same. You're going to see me putting a headphone on a mannequin. You're going to see me going to the computer, messing around with some keys, starting a procedure, and then eventually after actually quite a bit more time. Still, I mean, not that much time, but more time than typical. I'd be then taking the headphone off when I'm done evaluating it, right? So now what's the difference? What has happened? I know the answer to it, but the whole point is, what's the difference between what happened in the first procedure and the second?
The main difference is that with MDAQS, we're using a stimulus file that's a lot longer. So we still incorporate sweeps into our test file, our stimulus file, but we also include these 6 different musical compositions, basically 6 different musical pieces from different genres, into our stimulus file that is spaced out a little bit, some pauses in between. So we end up having a stimulus file of about 1 minute and 20 seconds to do our measurement. And then that measurement gets fed into the algorithm. So generally it takes a little bit longer to do, but we use the 6 musical pieces for a reason. Couple reasons. Primarily, we want to use music because we want to put the headphones into a realistic state. Like, very few people sit at home and listen to sine sweeps. They tend to listen to music, and so we want to put the headphones into a state or a condition that they ultimately will be used in, number one. Number two, music tends to be a lot more dynamic in terms of transients and in the time domain. We want to make sure that we are stressing the essentially the audio system, the driver of the headphones, just like they would be in real conditions, not just with a sweep, not just with pink noise or white noise or whatever you're used to, but with piano keys, with the strum of a guitar, with an 808, with a bass, something that you might be listening to. And lastly, these 6 musical compositions, they were used in our original jury study. And so when MDAQS, when we're done doing the recording and we have our 1 minute and 20 second long recording and we feed it into the MDAQS algorithm, it's essentially like asking your 300 favorite friends that have already listened to this, they already know, they've already given and passed judgment on this music piece. They can very quickly tell you, oh, this is what we like, this is what we don't like, this is how we would, prefer it, this is how we wouldn't prefer it, etc. And it would spit out the scores for you in terms of the overall quality and the 3 subdimensions.
Super duper compelling now. This is interesting. So what you're saying is, and I don't remember how much we talked about it already, but there's juried research that had been done with several hundred participants, right? And they were listening to these 6 tracks and asked to evaluate each of those 3 dimensions. Am I being accurate in recounting this? And then you're capturing that data. I mean, it's a carefully structured study. I've actually participated in it, even though I wasn't in the jury. And these were 300, like average consumers. But I wanted to see how it was structured. And then from that, okay. So that information is very important, though, that you captured from those several hundred humans, right? I mean, it's absolutely critical to all this.
Yeah, it's years of research that we're condensing into a very short video here, but we first had to get to the step where we knew what the 3 important dimensions were, if 3 were sufficient even.
Right.
So that took quite a lot of research even to figure out that we were able to predict overall quality very, very closely using these 3 subdimensions. That took a while. There's also other hurdles that we had to overcome in the jury study process in order to even get to the point of collecting this data.
Okay.
But in the end, what we end up doing is we collect a lot of human data. We separate the data into 2 chunks. We have a data set that's used exclusively for training, and then we have a data set unknown to the algorithm that we use for validation. So there's no overlap between the 2, but we can train the algorithm on one, and then before we go in the wild and release it, we validate it on another set of data. And this is where we need to make sure that we hit 90% or above in terms of our correlation.
So by the time I run an MDAQS evaluation on headphone X, and it scores a 4.5 overall, you're saying that if that would be, you feel with high confidence that if we were to take that same headphone and play it for several hundred people, and they were scoring it the way they did in the juried study, we would arrive at an overall score of 4.5.
Yes.
Okay. With a high degree of certainty.
Yes.
All right. That's pretty cool. So let's talk about, you already talked a little bit about timbre It's not just frequency response simply. It takes into account, like you said, temporal performance, so time domain performance. Okay, I got to be careful. I'm not trying not to get too technical here, but distortion. Can we talk? Let's start. Distortion is one I think is going to be maybe really easy to understand.
Okay.
Perceptual
Okay.
differences. So at CanJam, at a recent CanJam, there were a couple seminars that talked about human perception a little bit, and one of the examples that was given a couple different times, 2 different presentations, was distortion. Because right now, if I go to my analyzer and I measure THD, total harmonic distortion, I have headphone 1. We'll call it headphone A, just to keep this as simple as possible, and headphone B. Headphone A has a total harmonic distortion measurement of 1%. So THD expressed as a ratio, 1%. I have headphone B that has THD of 3%, total THD. I think if that's all you had to look at, right, we would conclude, I think, pretty easily, because that's what we have, that's what we're looking at, right? That headphone B is not as good as headphone A in terms of distortion.
That would be the natural conclusion based on the objective measurements.
That's correct. That's all. I'm going to the next part, right? So in these CanJam seminars, they played different kinds of distortion. Okay. So to a human now, what in at least one of the talks, they showed how, don't hold me to the numbers, but I think it was like one headphone that had particularly objectionable distortion, but would have had a THD measurement of approximately, I think it was 0.5% or something like that, versus one that had one that was much, much higher. It was in the single-digit percentages, could even been as high as 5%. That the one at 5%, maybe it was second-order harmonic distortion, which isn't as offensive, versus one that was at 0.5% that was maybe high-order, odd-order harmonic distortion, right, was more offensive. I mean, I think that would be quite a bit more offensive. That all of a sudden, the one that had much higher THD to a human was less offensive than the one that had much lower THD.
Yeah.
So looking at it the way an analyzer looks at it is not necessarily the way a human perceives it.
That's correct. And it's dangerous to make those assumptions just based on that one number.
But now as MDAQS evaluates distortion, does it take into consideration human perception of distortion? So distortion types, amounts and types.
Yes. So that's because the data is rooted in human evaluations. So when we measure a headphone, we will capture all kinds of distortion metrics, many different types of distortion metrics. We will measure THD and THD plus N inside the algorithm, but we need to find a way, and this is where the magic of the algorithm comes into play. We need to find a way where all of these different objective results correlate to the subjective data that we have from the human data. And that's sort of the secret sauce of the algorithm is there's much, much more than just looking at THD, and it has to correlate with human perception.
Okay. The reason I brought up distortion, I think that example is, it's one of the simpler ones, because by the time you get into all the things about, and I'm not even suggesting that that's all there is in the distortion dimension of MDAQS, but it's one that's easy to understand.
Sure.
With the timbre, it gets a lot more complex. So I'm not going to deep dive into that. I think with Dr. Gierlich we did a little bit more. I do want to talk a little bit about immersiveness.
Yeah.
And can we talk a little bit about what goes into that one?
We can, and it's going to be difficult to keep it simple because immersiveness is very hard to gauge using just pure objective metrics. Immersiveness has to do with source position, source width, in the reproduction of the sound, and trying to do that using objective metrics. We have some tools available to us that involve head-related transfer functions looking at interaural time differences and interaural level differences. But even then, it's very, very difficult to draw conclusions between those types of measurements and what people would prefer.
Okay.
And so when we look inside, underneath the hood of the MDAQS algorithm, and we take a deep dive there, it gets very technical, very fast, and involves extremely complex binaural hearing models that replicate the human hearing system binaurally, even goes so far as to simulate the cochlea hair cell movements inside the cochlea. It's incredibly complex. The best way for me to explain it is simply that it's a measure of how the sound stage and the imaging and how crisp the sound source localization is for that pair of headphones.
Okay. And because it's binaural, you have to measure both ears at the same time.
We have to, and I think that was a key criteria for us when we designed the algorithm, because we are binaural creatures. We always have both ears active. We can't, unlike our eyes that we can close, we cannot close our ears. We're always listening with both ears, and that's how we tend to enjoy music. And so we wanted the algorithm to be binaural as well. So it's not enough to just look at a single-sided measurement of a headphone cup. That doesn't tell us much about the imaging or the experience as a whole.
Okay. So now I want to just, again, I don't want to get too deep into this. The whole idea is to try to make this as digestible and easy to understand as possible. We'll have more conversations where we do deep dives like we did with Dr. Gierlich, maybe in different ways.
Sure.
I'm trying to think of a way I can do this and not get it, because it's so easy. Okay, let's look at it this way. So we talked about procedure, how it looks. One of the things that is fairly, and I brought this up with Dr. Gierlich, but I think this bears talking about here. Maybe we can talk about it in a slightly different way. I don't know. You said it's 1 minute and 20 seconds, right? We have it's actually 2 sweeps. It opens up with 2 sweeps, 1 for each channel. And then it does the 6 music tracks with pauses in between each stimulus. And so, but then that's 1 minute and 20 seconds long. And then I run the MDAQS evaluation using Aqua, which is the head acoustics software suite. And we're running it on a gaming PC from like 2018, but it's a liquid cooled Deca core. It's still pretty much a beast. And when I run it, it just absolutely pounds on every core of the CPU for like 8 straight minutes before it spits out the score. And you can see the CPU meters just absolutely throttled, and then they're topped out most of the time. So again, without getting too deep in the weeds, what's happening? Why is there so much computational, why is it doing so much? What is it doing?
It is correlating. It's doing a lot of calculations. It's an indication that there's a lot behind the MDAQS algorithm. We're trying to replicate the human hearing system over a very long audio file binaurally. So we're dealing with lots of data and trying to go through many different steps in grading the performance of this headphone in many different ways. Out of the 3 dimensions, each dimension will have multiple different parameters that need to be evaluated along the 6 different music steps and along the 2 different sweeps. So by the time you start adding this up, and especially in the immersiveness dimension, when we start to get into the binaural hearing model and we get to use fancy words like correlograms, it starts to become computationally very heavy. And I think if this is our first release of MDAQS, and the number one priority for us was to get it right. And I've been told, and Dr. Gierlich even mentioned as much, when we make an update, then we can start to think about, can we optimize the code, and can we optimize the routine and how it utilizes CPU availability in the PCs? Sure, but the number one goal was to get it right. And then from there, we can look at optimizations in terms of processing power.
But even with optimizations, it's still going to be far more computationally intensive than maybe what I'm used to.
Because we're not just calculating the area under a curve, or we're not just calculating the distance at, different octave bands to a target curve. It's a lot more intense than that.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about now what it is and what it isn't. I don't always agree with MDAQS. Right. That is, now I will say this, if one headphone scores like 4.5 and one scores 2.5 or 3, then I usually agree with it. I mean, in fact, I can't think of any example in which I probably didn't. But now you're talking like, say, 4.7 and 4.4 or 4.7, 4.1 even. I don't always agree with it. Why is that?
I think that's a question that's best answered by the fact that we are humans, and that's part of just human nature and the humanity of the algorithm as well. So if you look at your community,
Yeah.
and hopefully they get a chance to attend a Can Jam show, and they walk around and they listen to all the headphones there, you are very unlikely to find that every single member will like every single headphone or will like the same headphone. It's very unlikely, right? Because people have slightly different preferences. And at the end of the day, though, if you did ask everybody from Head5 that attended that Can Jam show, what did you think of headphone A, B, C, etc.? By the time you pool everybody's responses together, there is going to be an average consensus for each of these headphones. Now, within that group, especially once you start talking about a sample size of 100 plus people, there's going to be deviations.
Sure.
Some people are going to like headphone A more than headphone B, even if the average may be tilted the other way, and vice versa. And I think that's part of the humanity of MDAQS is sometimes people deviate from the norm. But MDAQS is really, much like the head and torsos that are available on the market, MDAQS is a way for you to take the average response. And this is the average of hundreds of people evaluating this pair of headphones. And you, in some cases, might be one of the outliers
Right.
in that. And in most cases, you might be in agreement with the consensus.
And it's hundreds of average consumer types. These are not hundreds of audiophiles.
So the people that participated in our jury studies, the only requirement were that they were untrained, in the sense that they weren't specifically trained or educated in the field of audio. It doesn't mean that they couldn't be audiophiles.
Okay.
They could certainly like music and audio and headphones. They just weren't trained in it. But it was generally a selection of people off the street, so to speak. It was the average consumer, because the intention with the MDAQS algorithm was to address the average consumer market, but doesn't mean that there couldn't have been audiophiles amongst the group.
Sure. But it is definitely more in line, say, with the average consumer than the average audiophile.
Yeah, so I think, audiophiles tend to enjoy maybe slightly leaner headphones relative to the average consumer. And I think MDAQS is going to follow more of the average consumer trend of maybe a little more bass and a little more than maybe
Sure.
what the average audiophile.
So I want to I do like the word humanity. I think that might have even gotten brought up with Dr. Gierlich, but the humanity part of it is why I'm interested in using it. It's exactly what you mentioned. I'm going to actually mention two specific headphones. So my reference headphone is a Sennheiser HE1. That would be, I guess, by MDAQS scoring, it would be a 5, for me, if I had to score it. Overall 5. And let's just go. Humans will often do 1 to 10 ratings. It's just common, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
we
right.
even had a movie called 10 with Bo Derek, because that's how old I am. But anyway, I would rank, say, for example, just to talk about humanity, not so much about scoring, but the HE1 is a 10. I would probably rank, like, two of my favorite headphones lately are like Focal Utopia 2022, ZMF headphones, Atrium. These are two headphones that measure nothing alike in terms of frequency response. Now, what I find with the frequency response target, right, is that it's too reductive. Because if you go by the idea of a target, you can't really score something similar to something else that's closer to a target, right, if the other one is further away from it, right? They're always going to score different. Well, that doesn't really tell me about what I like and what I don't like necessarily, right? Because those two headphones measure, again, nothing alike in terms of frequency response. But if you ask me to score them 1 through 10, I'd say that they're probably both. If the HE1 is a 10, I'd say the Utopia 2022 and Atrium, for me, I like them about equally. I would call them an 8.5-ish. And, the humanity part is that if at the end of a show I said to you, and that I like the Utopia, and you said score it, and I give you the score, and then you say, well, I like the Atrium, score it, and I give you the same score, you don't sit there as a human and say, I don't understand how you could possibly score them the same, because they don't sound alike. No, we understand as humans, I can like them both equally. I mean, headfires have multiple headphones, and there might be 2 or 3 of them that they like equally, but that sound nothing alike. And we all get that. That's an easy concept to understand. But when you look at a frequency response target method of evaluating a headphone, again, it's just simply too reductive. You move away from that humanity, to me anyway.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that you would have situations like that.
Yeah.
And it's
I
prevalent.
don't think it surprise anybody.
No, it's prevalent all over the community. And
Yeah.
I think that's part of the humanity of MDAQS. And I think that's part of the reason why people continue to make headphones that sound differently. That's why a lot of the companies show up at Can Jams to show off their headphones. And people continue to buy them and enjoy them. They sound a little bit different. They
Yeah.
measure a little bit different, but you can certainly like them equally. And I would not be surprised. And I have data myself that shows headphones that do measure very differently that people I know from the community enjoy equally. And yet MDAQS would also score them equally.
Right. All right. I actually don't know what the Utopia 2022 and Atrium score, but I like them about equally. So super interesting. And as far as humanity goes, even in this very office, we joke around about it. I think we've joked around about it in some of the videos that we've done, where Brian, who goes by Axelchlorus in our on the forums, and I like rather different headphones. I tend to prefer richer sounding, smoother sounding headphones. He tends to prefer, more, flatter bass response, maybe a little bit more treble energy than I like. Headphones, we tease each other about it all the time. And though we joke around about the other being wrong and the other one being right, it's a joke. When it comes right down to it, if you said to me, so is Brian wrong for liking that? Of course I wouldn't say he's wrong. That's what he likes. And that's humanity, right? We prefer, anyway, I think we're going to end it on that note because I like what we've done so far, right? Talked about it. I hope it's been a little easier to understand than a more technical discussion. And I'd like to end it on that note, the note of humanity. That's why we're interested in using it. We're going to be, again, showing more MDAQS scores for different products and different headphones, especially going into 2024. So, yeah, anyway, Jacob, thanks for coming out to HeadFi HQ. Since you do have occasion to come out here, I hope that you stop by again so we can talk maybe more about MDAQS, maybe do some more technical talks about it.
That would be great.
Maybe deeper dives into it, show the procedure. Anyway, thanks for coming out.
That would be great. Thanks for having me.
All right, man.